The war was ending, but Captain Jerry Yellin had not received the message. On August 14, 1945 in American records, already August 15 in Japan, the 21-year-old fighter pilot climbed into a P-51 Mustang on Iwo Jima and prepared to lead another attack against a Japanese airfield. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been hit. Japan's government was moving towards surrender. The pilots had been told that if the war ended while they were airborne, a radio code would order them back. The code word was Ohio. They never heard it. The older man in these opening images is Yellin himself, remembering the mission 70 years later. By the time Yellin returned, he would learn that the fighting had ended hours earlier. His wingman would not return at all. Second Lieutenant Philip Schlamberg was from Brooklyn. He joined Yellin's squadron late in the war, among men who had watched friends disappear over the Pacific. The night before the mission, Schlamberg told his flight leader he had a feeling he would not come back. Yellin did not dismiss him. He went to the commanding officer and repeated the warning. Only the flight surgeon could remove a pilot from the mission, and Schlamberg would have to agree to be examined. He refused. He was going to fly. One man voiced his fear. Another tried to act on it. Military duty, personal choice, and the pressure of not abandoning a formation met before either aircraft left the ground. Jerry Yellin had wanted to fly long before the United States entered the war. He grew up in New Jersey, built model airplanes, and followed Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers. After high school, he worked at Crucible Steel and saved for college. Then Pearl Harbor was attacked. Yellin decided to become a fighter pilot and fly against Japan. Aviation cadets needed college credits or an equivalent examination. Yellin passed the academic requirement but failed the physical because one eye tested at 20/30. He was told to rest it, eat carrots, and try again. His mother served on the local draft board. He asked her for an eye chart, memorized it, returned, and passed. It was an audacious shortcut toward a profession in which eyesight could decide whether a man lived. The Army Air Corps inducted Yellin in August 1942. Training moved through Fort Dix, Nashville, California, and Arizona. He soloed a steerman after only a few hours, then watched the aircraft swing around on landing when a tail wheel strap failed. An instructor arrived with the broken part and told him he was not washing out. Yellin advanced through the Vultee trainer, the AT-6, and finally the P-40. Another eye test nearly diverted him to transport aircraft. He went up the chain of command and insisted that he was already a fighter pilot. The commandant agreed. His path was a series of narrow administrative gates, mechanical failures, and young confidence. Anyone could have placed him somewhere else when August 1945 arrived. Yellin joined the 78th Fighter Squadron in Hawaii. On March 10, 1944, his P-40 lost its engine during a gunnery mission. He had imagined the emergency: slide the canopy back, release the straps, push the nose down, roll inverted, and move the stick so gravity would take him out. The parachute opened after a terrifying pause. His shoes and wristwatch were torn away, and he spent 9 hours in a one-man raft before rescue. At 6 the next morning, despite sunburn and sore shoulders, he was ordered to fly again. An aircraft could fail, a pilot could bail out, and the schedule still required him to return to the cockpit. Fear had to be carried into the next takeoff. By late 1944, the squadron received the aircraft its pilots wanted most, the P-51 Mustang. Their fighters were loaded onto the escort carrier Sitco Bay and sent west. At sea, the men learned the plan. Marines would invade Iwo Jima. Once an airfield was usable, fighters would move onto the island, support the battle, and escort B-29 bombers over Japan. Yellin landed on Iwo Jima on March 7, 1945. The battle was still underway. He remembered the sights, sounds, and smell of an island where tens of thousands of Americans and Japanese were fighting across roughly 8 square miles. Pilots lived in foxholes, endured mortar attacks, and flew strafing missions for Marines. The airfield sat inside the evidence of what capturing it had cost. On April 7, Yellin joined the first long-range fighter escort from Iwo Jima to Japan. The Mustangs flew with B-29s attacking Tokyo. At altitude, he watched small fires join into broad areas of flame, while smoke rose toward the formation. He later admitted that he did not think about the people below. During the war, he saw an enemy and a target. That honesty prevents the story from becoming a clean adventure about machines. The P-51's range connected Iwo Jima to Japan and protected the bombers. It also carried young pilots into a campaign where operational success meant destruction on the ground. Yellin flew 19 missions over Japan. Each required manual concentration, navigation, fuel discipline, and the possibility that weather, engine trouble, anti-aircraft fire, or another fighter would end the flight. The route itself was a weapon against the pilots. Japan lay about 700 miles from Iwo Jima, so a mission could occupy most of a day. A Mustang carried external tanks, but they would be dropped before combat. After that point, every gallon narrowed the choices. Rescue aircraft known as Dumbos, Navy ships, and submarines were positioned along the route, yet the Pacific remained enormous around a disabled fighter. Yellin described 8 hours with both hands engaged and no automatic pilot. Fatigue changed what a pilot saw and how quickly he reacted. Fuel gauges determined when the formation had to break away. The mission was the long outbound leg, brief violence over land, and a return across water with less fuel, fewer options, and sometimes fewer aircraft. By August, Yellin had flown with 16 men who did not come back. His tentmate Al Sharon was killed in July after reporting that he had been hit and could not see. Danny Matthijs took Yellin's place on a June mission because a toothache had grounded him. Matthijs died when fighters were led into a violent weather front. Dick Schropel was lost after following Yellin on a strafing mission. These names gave chance a personal shape. A medical problem could save one man and place another in his aircraft. A cloud could be ordinary moisture or the edge of a fatal storm. Survival had not made Yellin feel protected. It left him carrying men whose last formation included him. Then came Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9. News traveled unevenly through the Pacific, but the strategic meaning was impossible to miss. On August 13, Yellin's squadron saw that another mission was scheduled. The pilots asked why they were being sent when Japan appeared close to surrender. Their commander answered that pressure had to continue until surrender was certain. The target was an airfield in the Nagoya area. Yellin would lead a flight, and Schlamberg would be on his wing. The younger pilot's warning came in that atmosphere, not before an ordinary mission at the height of the campaign, but while men believed the war might end at any hour. Yellin's attempt to take the warning seriously could not settle the problem. Schlamberg chose to remain on the roster, and the organization continued toward the mission it had been ordered to execute. Carefully sourced stories like this depend on holding the operational facts and the human cost in the same frame. If that is what you want from Frontline Brief, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments which part of this mission changes how you think about the end of a war. The question is not whether the pilots should have known what their commanders did not yet know. It is how people act when history has changed faster than the orders reaching them. On Iwo Jima, the engines were running, the mission plan was active, and the cancellation signal remained only a possibility. Schlamberg's fear did not stop the schedule. Yellin's concern did not create authority he did not have. The two pilots were about to enter the narrow space between an approaching surrender and a chain of command still operating as if combat could continue. Before takeoff, Yellin briefed Schlamberg to remain close. Rescue coverage stretched along the route. Large aircraft overhead, patrol planes, destroyers, and submarines positioned for pilots who went into the water. If surrender became official, the code word Ohio was supposed to come over the radio. The formation departed Iwo Jima and flew north. Every mile increased the cost of turning back, but the pilots listened. No Ohio came. Near Japan, they reached the point where the external tanks had to be released. Dropping them was both a routine procedure and a commitment. The reserve that carried the Mustangs across the ocean was gone. The internal fuel now had to support the attack and the flight home. The code still had not been heard. Yellin's formation continued toward the airfield under the rules and information it possessed. The Mustangs descended and strafed the target. Yellin's own account is direct but limited, and the surviving archival film must be treated the same way. We can show P-51s operating from Iwo Jima, fighters crossing water, external tanks, Japanese airfields, and contextual gun camera or combat footage. We cannot honestly claim that a particular strip of film records Yellin or Schlamberg on this exact attack unless the archive identifies it. The important sequence is supported without invention. The cancellation code was not received, the external tanks were dropped, the formation attacked, and fuel determined when it had to leave. There is no need to manufacture a duel or an explosion. The tragedy does not depend on seeing Schlamberg shot down. It depends on how little Yellin saw when the young pilot vanished. The formation used a fuel threshold for withdrawal. When the first pilot reported reaching the required reserve, the squadron began moving out toward its B-29 navigation and escort aircraft. Yellin looked across and saw Schlamberg still on his wing. He raised a thumb. Schlamberg returned the gesture. It was a small exchange through two canopies, confirmation, reassurance, and perhaps the final answer to the warning spoken the night before. Yellin then led his flight into cloud. Pilots sometimes lost sight of one another for seconds in weather, but formation discipline demanded that the wingman reappear. Yellin emerged and looked again. The other Mustang was gone. No crash was visible. No radio transmission explained a mechanical problem, an attack, or a direction of fall. Cloud had interrupted the line of sight, and silence completed the disappearance. Searching could not ignore fuel. Surviving aircraft still had hundreds of miles of ocean between Japan and Iwo Jima. Yellin had to lead the formation home while carrying the knowledge that the pilot who predicted his own loss was no longer beside him. Rescue forces found no answer that restored Schlamberg to the squadron. When Yellin landed, he learned that the war had already ended while the mission was underway. In later testimony, he said the fighting had been over for about 3 hours while they attacked. Official military profiles identify his flight as the final fighter combat mission of the Second World War. That description is narrower and more defensible than claiming that every weapon everywhere had already fallen silent. Governments had reached a decision. Messages, orders, and armed forces were still catching up. For Schlamberg, the distance between those facts was final. Yellin later called Schlamberg the last man killed on an active mission in the war. That was his understanding, shaped by the empty place beside his aircraft. Historical caution requires us to present it as Yellin's claim rather than a universally provable ranking of every death across the Pacific and Asia. What is beyond dispute is intimate enough. Schlamberg was 19. He told his flight leader he feared he would not return. Yellin sought a way to remove him from the mission. Schlamberg flew anyway. Near the end of the attack, the two men exchanged a thumbs up. A cloud passed between them, and only one came back to Iwo Jima. The surrender announcement could stop future missions. It could not reverse a mission already completed or recover a pilot whose last known position existed only in another man's memory. Coming home did not end the war inside Yellin. He returned to the United States late in 1945, left active service as a captain, and briefly joined the New Jersey National Guard to fly P-51. The aircraft no longer had a wartime purpose for him. He had trained it as a weapon, and without an enemy, the act of flying felt empty and dangerous. For 3 decades, he lived with symptoms now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. He described anger, depression, unstable work, and difficulty finding direction. The 16 pilots who had not returned remained present in his thoughts. At the time, there was no ordinary public language inviting a fighter pilot to say that survival itself had become an injury. The culture that trained men to complete a mission was far less prepared to help them understand why the mission continued after landing. In 1949, Yellin met Helene Schulman on a blind date. They married that October and built a family while he continued struggling. In 1975, after Helene learned transcendental meditation, Yellin tried it and credited the practice with transforming his behavior and giving him his life back. His account is personal, not a universal medical prescription, but it marks the first relief he believed had reached the source of his pain. He later became an advocate for veterans facing post-traumatic stress. He spoke about suicide, isolation, and the need to treat invisible wounds as seriously as physical ones. That work changed the meaning of his final mission. The missing wingman was no longer only a wartime memory. Schlamberg and the other 15 men became part of Yellin's argument that surviving combat does not guarantee that a person has safely returned. Yellin's relationship with Japan also changed. In 1983, he traveled there for business after years of refusing to go. The first days brought back images of bombers and burning cities. Yet his son Robert later moved to Japan and planned to marry a Japanese woman named Takako. Yellin met her father, who had also lived through the war from the other side, and the families agreed to the marriage. Yellin came to describe that union and his Japanese grandchildren as a form of reconciliation he could not have imagined while looking through a Mustang gun sight. This does not erase the invasion, the bombing, or the men who died. Reconciliation is not amnesia. It is the decision that inherited hatred will not be given control of another generation. A pilot who once saw only an enemy country learned to see individual families, including one joined to his own. Jerry Yellin died in 2017 at 93 and was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery the following year. Official records remember his distinguished flying cross, his 19 missions over Japan, and his place in the final fighter combat mission. The more difficult record is the one he preserved in his own voice. The young wingman who voiced a fear, the code that never reached them, the thumbs up before cloud, the 16 absent pilots, and the 30 years it took to feel fully alive after returning. Archival film can show Mustangs, Iwo Jima, Japanese airfields, surrender crowds, and an older Yellin speaking. It cannot photograph the silence that followed him home. The last mission did not end when his wheels touched the runway. For Jerry Yellin, it ended slowly through testimony, treatment, family, reconciliation, and the decision to make one missing aircraft visible to people born long after the war was over.